He called it comedy, but what he really did was legitimize hate. Gerald Monroe, a veteran talk show host with decades of clout, thought he could blend in at a rally laced with chants of exclusion and bigotry. He laughed when they jeered, clapped when they mocked, and later brushed it off on national TV. Across from him sat Congresswoman Elena Brooks, calm, composed, and armed not with anger, but with truth. He saw a quiet black woman and expected compliance. But he was wrong. Because when they picked Elena Brooks, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was a civil rights attorney, a two-term congresswoman, and a daughter of the very communities he dismissed with a smirk. What came next wasn't just justice, it was a moment of reckoning, broadcast live. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man, it's about all of us. Studio lights buzzed faintly overhead as the room waited. Gerald leaned back, still thinking he owned the floor, but Elena was about to show him, and all of us, that silence in the face of harm isn't neutrality, it's complicity. The studio light shimmered off the glass mug in Peter Marr's hand as he leaned back in his signature pose, casual, cocky, untouchable. For decades, Peter had branded himself as the master of uncomfortable truths, a man unafraid to poke at both the left and the right. That night, his grin was a little wider than usual. He had just returned from what he cheekily called a comedy field trip, a rally held deep in the heart of Southern territory, where red hats were more common than traffic lights. "I went to understand the madness," he joked to his live audience, laughter rolling in like a soft wave. "The tribalism, the merch tables, come on, it's a satire goldmine." They laughed. Not all of them, but enough to keep the mood light. What most didn't know, what Peter didn't say, was that he hadn't just observed. He had clapped. He had chuckled when someone yelled from the back row about real Americans. He had stood silently when a young journalist was booed for asking a question about voter rights. He would later insist that he wasn't endorsing anything. He hadn't worn a campaign button. He hadn't shouted any slogans. "I'm just a guy with a mic," he said. But is it ever just a mic when millions are listening? That was the first thread that began to unravel the myth of neutrality he had wrapped himself in. Because sometimes showing up isn't neutral. Sometimes silence is louder than speech. And sometimes just being there, laughing at the wrong time, standing next to the wrong cheer, gives permission for something uglier to grow. He called it comedy. But what happens when the punchline lands on someone else's dignity? There's a kind of danger in mistaking proximity for understanding, a kind of violence in dressing up a spectacle of hate as a cultural safari. Peter thought he had gone to observe the flames. He didn't realize he was fanning them. So I ask you, have you ever thought you were just watching, only to realize too late that your silence had already spoken for you? Sometimes the harm isn't in what we say, it's in what we let slide. She didn't need a spotlight. When Elena Brooks took her seat at the far end of the panel that night, she wore quiet like armor. No grand entrance, no dramatic gestures, just a poised presence, a kind that doesn't demand attention but refuses to be ignored. Her eyes scanned the room like she was measuring the air, and when Peter Marr finally turned to her with that usual smirk, his tone dipped into something half joking, half daring. "So, Congresswoman Brooks," he said, mug still in hand, "I assume you've got thoughts?" There was laughter, soft and scattered. The audience didn't know yet what was coming. Elena adjusted her mic. Not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. "I do," she said, voice low but firm. "But let's not confuse this with a comedy bit. This isn't about merch tables or punchlines. It's about the weight of presence and what it means when someone with a platform stands in a place that openly cheers for exclusion." The words landed with the sharpness of a whisper that cuts through noise. The studio, moments before buzzing with light-hearted energy, fell into a stillness that made Peter shift slightly in his seat. "That's a little harsh, isn't it?" he offered, trying to recapture the levity. Elena didn't blink. "Do you think so?" That pause, that refusal to fill the silence, was the first real crack in the room. Then she continued, her tone steady. "You weren't just observing, Peter. You were laughing with people who cheered when a reporter was told to go back to where they came from. That's not discomfort. That's cruelty. And you stood next to it like it was a joke." The room inhaled. Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no punchline waiting. How many times do we stay quiet in the name of keeping peace, even when peace is just a polite disguise for harm? She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Her restraint held more power than outrage. She folded her hands, looking at him, not with disdain, but with clarity. "You call it comedy," she said, "but when you walk away from a fire and tell the world it's not that hot, someone else is left to burn." And just like that, the laughter from earlier felt like it belonged to a different room. Peter leaned forward, his usual cool just a touch unsteady. The rhythm of the room had changed, and for once, he wasn't conducting it. "Look," he began, fingers tapping the arm of his chair. "I'm not defending anything hateful. I didn't shout slurs. I didn't lead a chant. I just observed. If I can't go to a rally without being labeled a traitor, how do we ever fix the divide?" He meant it as a deflection, but Elena heard it as a question, and she answered it like she always did, with truth wrapped in calm steel. "No one called you a traitor," she said, voice unwavering. "But when you walk into a space where cruelty is cheered and you laugh, even politely, you're not just an observer. You become a part of what that space represents." The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was intentional. She let it linger. Then, with the gravity of lived experience, she added, "You say you're trying to understand, but did you tell them what they needed to hear when you were there? Or did you tell your audience what they wanted to hear after you left?" Peter glanced down, just briefly. A flicker of realization, then gone. There's a difference between hearing both sides and weighing what those sides call. Elena shifted slightly in her seat, not for drama, but for emphasis. "I represent families in South Dallas who've been threatened for putting a sign in their front yard. I've had constituents followed home, called names, told to leave stores, because someone assumed they were the enemy." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened. That kind of hate doesn't just appear, it's fed, it's allowed, and when people with cameras and audiences and influence visit those places and call it a field trip, it tells everyone else watching that maybe the fear isn't real. She turned, not to Peter, but to the audience, and beyond them, to the people watching at home. So, ask yourself, have you ever made someone else's pain smaller, just because it wasn't your own? There are no neutral corners when the fire is already lit. Peter's fingers steepled together now, elbows on the desk, his usual grin replaced by something else. Uncertainty. Maybe discomfort. Maybe the slow dawning of awareness. Still, he tried again. "But don't you think," he said cautiously, "there's value in just listening, in going where the tension is, and showing I'm not afraid to engage, even if I don't agree?" Elena didn't interrupt. That was her rhythm. Let people speak long enough and they reveal what they haven't yet reckoned with. Only when he finished did she answer. "Listening is good," she said. "But you didn't just listen. You laughed. You stood beside people shouting things that would get a child sent home if they said it in the school hallway. And when it was over, you used your platform to soften the truth." Peter started to interject, but she held up one finger, barely, gently, and continued. "You called it an experiment in comedy, but you didn't tell that crowd the fire was real. You walked out and told the world it wasn't that hot." The room exhaled. Long, low, waited. "People don't always need you to fight their battles," she said, her voice quieter now. "But they need to know you see the battle, that you don't mistake hate for humor just because you left untouched." Peter shifted, clearly uncomfortable. And that was the point. How many times do we excuse cruelty because it comes dressed in laughter? Then came the story. Quiet. Devastating. I met a student in Fort. The applause didn't come right away. When the taping ended, there was no triumphant music, no standing ovation, just a long, unsettled quiet that clung to the edges of the room like smoke. Elena Brooks had not raised her voice, had not waved a finger, but somehow she'd shifted the air so profoundly that even the stage crew stopped moving. Peter Marsh stayed seated longer than usual, staring into the floor lights. He looked like a man replaying a conversation he wasn't ready for, but knew he needed. Elena didn't wait for approval. She stood, nodded politely to the panel, and walked off set without another word. She wasn't there for the cameras. She was there for something larger. And that's when it started. A woman in the audience, a retired teacher from Fresno, posted a grainy clip filmed from her phone. Just one line. You don't have to march with extremists to be useful to them. It hit social media before the credits even stopped rolling. By midnight, it had gone viral. The footage was shaky, but the message was crystal. Across the country, people began resharing it with captions like, "Finally someone said it." A grocery clerk in Ohio played it during a lunch break. A high school civics teacher in Missouri paused it mid-sentence and asked her students, "What does accountability actually look like?" Elena never commented. She just reposted a few clips and went back to her work in Congress. No victory laps, no podcast tour, just the quiet conviction of someone who knew the truth didn't need an echo to matter. Still, the echoes came. A student in Fort Worth stitched the clip with his own story of staying silent in class. A nurse in Arizona added subtitles for her immigrant parents. A barista in Boston typed out Elena's words and taped them near the register. Silence isn't neutral, it's a choice. So let me ask you this. Have you ever underestimated how far your words or your silence might travel once you leave the room? Because sometimes the moment you stop talking is when your message truly begins. Days passed, but the moment didn't fade. Peter Marr opened his next podcast with a tone far from his usual swagger. No snide remarks, no sarcastic spin. "Congressman Brooks gave me a lot to think about," he said slowly. "I don't agree with everything she said, but I heard her. I really did." That might not sound like much, but for a man who'd made a career out of out-talking, outsmarting, and out-laughing everyone else in the room, it was a seismic shift. Not a collapse, something more subtle, a recalibration. And across the country, people noticed. Not because Peter apologized, he didn't, but because for once, he didn't try to be clever. He didn't retreat into comedy. He sat in the discomfort she left behind and let it change him, if only a little. Elena never called it a win. When asked in an interview if she'd return to the show, she shrugged lightly and said, "If invited, but I'm not here to win arguments on air. I'm here to make sure voices that don't get the mic still get heard." No spotlight, no mic drop, just purpose. It was that clarity that lingered, that clarity that traveled. 1 week later, a small bookstore in Atlanta hosted a community discussion about media responsibility, spurred by Elena's exchange. A church group in Indiana printed her words into their monthly bulletin. "Don't pretend your presence is neutral. Don't act like you're silenced." She hadn't just spoken to Peter, she had spoken to us, to the people who scroll past hate and call it apathy, to the ones who shrug at cruelty and name it tolerance. Until you? Reading this now. When was the last time you mistook comfort for clarity, silence for safety? And because the most dangerous form of complicity rarely wears a hood or carries a sign. Sometimes it sits in a studio audience, claps politely, and calls it not that bad. But as Elena reminded the world that night, the loudest voices aren't always yelling. Sometimes they're simply telling the truth and refusing to look away. Silence in the face of harm is never neutral. It either softens the truth or strengthens the hurt. Our presence, our words, and even our stillness carry weight. There comes a time in life when we realize that doing nothing isn't always harmless. We think silence keeps the peace, but often it simply protects the wrong things. What this story reminds us is that being present in the world, whether in a living room, a voting booth, or a conversation, means choosing what we stand beside and what we quietly walk away from. We don't need to raise our voices to make a difference. Sometimes, all it takes is asking the right question or refusing to laugh when something isn't funny. Sometimes it's choosing not to nod along just to keep things smooth. At any age, we are never too far from the power of presence. And it's not about being loud, it's about being clear. So, if you've ever wondered whether your silence mattered, this is your reminder. It does, it always has. And it's never too late to choose to stand in the light, even if all you do is speak a quiet truth where it's needed most. It didn't end with applause. Elena didn't need it. Her power wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the stillness she left behind. The kind of stillness that invites reflection, not reaction. A quiet power that didn't shout to be heard, but settled deep into those willing to listen. In that silence, something shifted. Not just on stage, but in living rooms, classrooms, and conversations across the country. After the lights dimmed, what remained was the work, the slow, steady rebuilding of trust, the recentering of voices too long ignored. Justice didn't come wrapped in a headline. It came in awareness, in accountability, in the courage to no longer pretend harm is harmless. The echoes of that night didn't fade. They grew. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.